I was just interested in getting an overview from you about where you think the Chabad community is at in terms of dealing with child sex abuse, because you briefly touched upon the fact that you think the victims may still be intimidated. Just a global overview of where you think they're at in terms of progress.
For those who didn't hear, just asking about where Chabad is on this issue of child sexual abuse now. It's very difficult. We say Chabad. Chabad is a global movement.
Melbourne.
So we're talking about Chabad Melbourne in the Yeshiva Centre. As I said, I think the developments have been very promising. Just a few days ago, ASIC has approved the new governance structure in there. They've opened it up now, the membership for nominations for a new board. So there's a lot of very positive things. Just a few weeks ago, me and two other Yeshiva victims went to meet with the Yeshiva Beth Rivka leadership, the management there, the school management, and there was about 15 of them, and we had an honest, open conversation around these issues. I think there are many good people within that institution who really want to see change and are working to do what they can around that. Doesn't mean there aren't hiccups along the way, mistakes, but there is a channel of communication between us, and we do, from my perspective, that's a very welcome development. Having said that, I think there is still some of the old guard influence there, and as I understand it, I haven't looked at every detail of the new constitution, and as I understand it, the new structure includes providing governance or leadership positions and responsibility to, if I'm not mistaken, at least two members of the Board of Trustees. So there are a few people who have been on there for decades, and they are still going to retain their authority for the next few years. Now, I personally have an issue with that. Anyone, in my opinion, who had any leadership role on the Board of Trustees or Committee of Management cannot have any leadership positions within that institution, full stop. I can tell you as a victim, and those who I speak to as well, when we see the names of these individuals still there as leaders, it is traumatizing. There was one incident I'll never forget in Israel when I was seeing a therapist, and I won't go into detail, I think it's in the book. And I remember it seems insignificant, but I remember receiving an email, it was just before the leadership changes, the governance changes, and I saw that some of these changes were being made, but I noticed the fact that Chaim Tzvi and the late Rabbi Grona, he's been appointed for life tenure on the Board of Trustees, as one example. And I went I just briefly saw that email, and I went into my therapy session, and I actually went there very relaxed. The first time I went there, I was quite relaxed, and it was the worst session I ever had, directly because of that email that I saw. And I saw the fact that there won't be those changes, that it's basically a slap in the face to victims. And it was terrible. It was terrible. I had a massive panic attack in there, had to stop the session. I really felt, I remember writing on it on Facebook, I felt like it was across the road from the beach. She's in Herzliya in Israel. I just wanted to go into the water, go into the beach, and just never come back. That's to that degree. And, to the leaders, not just Yeshiva, often there's that disconnect between putting pen to paper and thinking about the consequences of what you're doing and what you're writing. And that's been lacking over the years. They're getting better at it. It's a complex issue, and what may be sensitive to me may be okay for someone else. So I don't expect them to get it right, but sometimes, all the time. But it's an ongoing issue. But as I said, I like to focus more on the positive. We've got that dialogue going on. There's improvements to be had, but certainly they're on the right track.
Yep. Manny, thank you very much for being so eloquent and for telling your story so bravely. I think David started by saying that you're the only advocate, so I wonder if you could tell us why you think that might be. And related to Michael's last question, I understand that you've founded an organisation here, you founded an organisation in Israel, where you continue to hear stories on a daily basis. What gives you inspiration to continue that work, considering that you hear those stories, and I'm sure it affects you on a personal level?
Yeah. I'll focus
the
on
first one, Dave, why you think you're the only advocate?
Oh, yes, okay. So let's just clarify. So there are 3 victims' names have been published publicly. I was the first one. My brother Yankee disclosed his name and exposed himself on the second documentary, Breaking the Silence, on the ABC. And at some point, Yaakov Wolf gave one interview. He lives in LA, but he's not a victim advocate, but He did give an interview, so people are aware of his name as well. Why do I think that no other victim advocate has come out in the Australian Jewish community, or at least using his name? Because there are advocates behind the scenes, some who were abused, some who weren't, but there are people working behind the scenes. I think a lot of people have told me I'd like to come out, but I've seen what happens to you and your family. I think it's an obvious kind of reason why people wouldn't want to. Of course, that even if there wasn't the intimidation, it's still very difficult for anyone to acknowledge, to admit that they had been sexually abused. A very small percentage ever disclose to anyone that they were sexually abused, and the majority who do, usually on average it's 20 years plus for them to disclose that it happened to them. So that, anyway, should highlight the profound and long-term impact of child sexual abuse. So even outside the Chabad community or the Jewish community, but the fact that no one else, I think, is telling, because if we look at communities around the world, there are many victim advocates in Israel, in the US, over the last few years who have come out. But of course, they've got much larger communities. What gives me the inspiration to continue this work, as I say, is really, I was flown to New York, and then I went to Mexico. Just about 2 months ago, I was there in the Jewish community. I went there for a leadership summit and an Nachum Goldman fellowship. And when I was there were a couple of leaders in the local community, in the Jewish community, who heard my story. I gave a presentation there, and they said, "Do you mind delaying your trip another couple of days and come speak to our community about this issue, because we've had one case recently." So they brought me there, a whole lot of meetings. Then they asked me to extend my trip again, because what turned out, all of a sudden, that people heard that I was there. A whole lot of more cases came out, and there were about 10 odd cases from one case that they thought about. And suddenly I'm meeting with parents, I'm meeting with rabbis who have never even talked about this issue. So what gives me the inspiration is actually to continue this process of education, awareness, raising. These individuals had no idea about child sexual abuse. There were ultra-Orthodox schools there. I met with principals who didn't know anything about this issue. And then you've got more complicated issues, because you've got Mexico, the police aren't that reliant. Complete corruption there. And I was stunned, because usually over here, you don't want to tell the police for fear of someone a fellow Jew going to jail. But what was interesting there, they said, the issue here, we work with the police in a different way. If we want to put someone in jail, we'll pay the police money and we'll tell them what they did, and they'll end up in jail. So the issue of reporting is a little bit different over there than it is over here. So you have to deal with the cultural sensitivities of cases like that. But teaching, learning, hearing from victims that they've improved, and some of it has to do with what I've done. They're following my lead in certain things. It does give me the strength to continue. It doesn't feel like that every day, I can assure you. I've got some days there where I feel I've got no strength to do anything, and what can I actually give, and I don't want to talk to anyone, and I can't. But I try to make that an exception rather than the rule.
Yep. I had some involvement with a victim, and it caused me to talk to people about it. One of the people I talked to was a retired teacher, and he said that for a man to walk into a classroom full of 14-year-old girls is very dangerous, because even if they say that he looked at it the wrong way, his career and probably his life is finished. How do you work out a system which protects the victim, but also protects other people? Because it's very easy to make those sort of allegations, and the system has to protect all.
I take the question. I accept the concern, but I think that's an exaggeration in terms of, if we all behave as we should, usually, false allegations are very infrequent when we're talking about child sexual abuse on children. I think it's only about less than 5% of cases have been proven to be false.
He was scared to be a teacher. He was scared. He said,
I'm sure there are all sorts of people who may be scared of doing a whole lot of things, so that's not necessarily based on research, but it's certainly, people would be frightened to put themselves in all sorts of positions, and therefore it's important to have appropriate policies and procedures in place so that there wouldn't be these allegations. For example, if the classroom has glass windows so people walking past can see it, then those issues aren't, that can be addressed. So, but even in my book, I actually address that issue in terms of when is it appropriate to disclose allegations publicly about an individual, because as you say, it can ruin careers, it can ruin reputations, etc. If it was up to me, I think in the majority of cases, I think they should all be held behind closed doors until the allegations are proven, and then they can be shared in the media, reported on. Of course, it's not always possible, and sometimes it's advantageous to share allegations because it brings in more victims, because they see that this person has already been charged and the like. So it's a complex issue. I don't necessarily have all the answers. At times I have been uncomfortable with the way I've seen these issues reported on. Of course, in the UK there have been a lot of controversies around that, because there was this individuals who made allegations about the former Chief of Staff of the Army, a former Prime Minister, and all that, I think, got disproved at the end. So we do really need to be careful. From what I've seen, generally the reporting around this issue, certainly in the Australian media, has always been very responsible. It doesn't mean no mistakes, but responsible.
We've got time for just one last question on the floor.
Alicia.
Two questions. One is how many children were sexually abused in Yeshiva that you know of? That's one question. And the other question is, okay, answer that and then I will know.
Just a quick one. I think the answer is dozens. I'm aware of dozens. I'm sure there are many.
Dozens?
Dozens.
Yeah,
look,
I know, but
it's difficult. I don't want to say figure. I'll tell you why. Because again, I mentioned about this in the book. David Kramer was the teacher in the early 90s.